Well, thanks for having me along. As Emil says, a lot of my examples are sort of down in the south of the country. I used to cover quite a big area when I was with the Wild Trout Trust, and before that, I was in private contracting for a little while and covered a sort of slightly bigger area then. But nowadays, very much in the Wessex Rivers Trust sort of patch, which covers the Dorset Stour, the Hampshire Avon, the Test, the Itchen, the New Forest, and some of the East Hampshire streams. And the majority of that is chalk streams. So there, quite a lot of these examples are focused on the chalk streams. So I've been working in river conservation, as I said, for about 15 years now. Started in the commercial sector, site managing, and then project managing for river restoration and soft engineering projects. I moved to the charitable sector with the Wild Trout Trust in 2012, and a lot of that work involved engaging with landowners, angling clubs, various community groups, other NGOs, and also a fair bit of advisory work for government agencies as well. These days, doing a lot more sort of river restoration design work than the practical work that I used to do, but I still do get to work at the coalface occasionally. We have a sort of decent stint of delivery work in the autumn each year, so I still get to get out and splash around at least a few times a year. So focusing on the issues that face our rivers, the threats can largely be placed into one of three categories: either habitat quality, water quality, or water quantity or flow. And there's a whole range of issues that kind of fall into one of those three categories. But I think the important thing to understand is that there's a great many that actually overlap and can compound each other and sometimes create ever more complex and interlinked problems. And the interdependency of these issues can be visualized quite nicely in what I like to think of as the three-legged bar stool of river health. Now, the idea here is that no matter how strong the other legs are, you neglect one leg and you fall down and probably spill your beer. So what is a healthy river anyway? What do we actually mean when we talk about a river being healthy? Well, obviously the most obvious thing a healthy river needs is clean water. It needs enough of that water. It needs good connectivity of habitat. Things need to be connected. Life needs to be able to get from one part of a river to another. It needs a good diversity of habitat, a good range of different habitat types, and lots of different habitat features. And just to kind of break that down a touch, things like cover habitat for birds, fish, and mammals. That could come in the form of submerged woody material. It could be roots. It could be marginal plants, overhanging vegetation. The river needs to have things like pools and riffles, diversity of depth. The gravel in rivers is incredibly important, as is the finer sediment, silt. So long as it's in the right places and in the right amounts. We need a good variation of flow moving in lots of different directions at lots of different speeds, and we need good connectivity with the surrounding floodplain. Now, I think most school children could tell you what this is. This is a food chain. Very, very simple, very easy to understand. unfortunately, it's almost total nonsense. The ecology doesn't actually work like this. If you actually wanted to draw lines between different animals and who eats who, some people have done that. As an example here, this is actually for, I think, Atlantic cod. It's not a great resolution, but the point of this is it's an absolute chaotic mess. And what does it actually tell you? How does this help you do ecology and conservation work? It doesn't really. So what a more useful way to think about ecosystems is to actually think about flows of energy. So this is what we call a trophic pyramid. This is all about how energy moves from the primary producers up through herbivores to primary predators, then secondary predators, and finally tertiary predators. And actually each time a little bit less energy is passed on. And you'll see at the bottom of the pyramid is what we call the abiotic factors. And in rivers, this is water quality and habitat. And the broader the base of that pyramid, really the more energy is getting passed up, the bigger the ecosystem it can support. So it's a phrase you might hear quite often thrown around when it comes to a lot of conservation, actually, is something called shifting baseline syndrome. This is the idea that in the case of rivers anyway, the healthy rivers of our past have basically been forgotten. We have so few examples of really good quality river habitat in the UK that most people can't actually readily see how terrible our rivers are. Now, I'm sure everyone gets asked this question. You're at some sort of social event, someone's making small talk, and it's normally a pretty benign question. What do you do for a living? I absolutely dread this question because I try and explain to people why I sort of fix rivers for a living, and you always get the same response, which is something along the lines of, well, I didn't know they were broken. When actually, yes, unfortunately, nearly all of them are. So what's broken? What do we mean when I say that a river is broken? Well, there's lots of ways a river can be broken. We can have things like really excessive rates of erosion, heavy sedimentation of the riverbed, something that thankfully a lot more people are familiar with nowadays is issues of water quality, both from sewage and from agriculture. I mean, spot which of the streams here has got the arable farm upstream. Funny enough, this is that farm. This is on dry land, supposedly. This is pouring straight into the river. And another example here of this is a cattle feeder. This, for some reason, this was actually in the woods on a hill, sloping right down to the river, and just some really crazy things you sometimes see. Water quantity, increasingly we're seeing rivers drying up. It's been very severe in the southeast of the country for quite a long time. A classic example of the Chilterns chalk streams, rivers that are flowing through catchments where there is now less water available per capita than there is in Darfur, which a lot of people don't know that about England, that actually we are becoming quite desperately short of water in some parts of the country. This year with the drought, we saw that much more widespread. Earlier in the year, I was walking on a section of chalk stream that's not supposed to dry up every year, walking essentially down a gravel path with no river in sight. And some very, very poor habitat out there. No prizes for guessing, that this isn't an ideal river environment. And it's there's a lot of obviously kind of quite stark, obvious urban habitat problems, but actually get out into the countryside and you'll come across just as many examples of quite poor habitat. And none of these issues are in isolation. They can all be caused by and lead to other issues. And as I said, they can all kind of compound each other, give rise to more complex problems. But I would argue there is one particular aspect of river habitat degradation that we can point the finger at, and in a lot of cases say that's the primary culprit, and that's floodplain disconnection. No prizes for guessing that none of these images are from the UK. This is what our rivers and floodplains used to look like. This is what they should look like. Our valleys should be patchworks of wetlands with braided multi-channel river systems flowing through them that are in constant flux, always changing, always shifting and moving with the seasons, and really quite resilient to fluctuations in climate, because there's so many options, there's so many routes for life to take. But of course, UK examples look much more like this. We're much more used to thinking of rivers as single-stemmed, single-channel, kind of uniform entities. Now, it's a good example here. You might see just slightly to the right of the screen, there's a bit of a wiggly line going through the field here, sort of remnants of an old paleo channel. You'll come across this in a surprising amount of the country, and actually when we have things like droughts, it's a good time, because actually drone footage and aerial photography, when things start sort of drastically drying out, a lot of these features come to the surface. But we can actually use modern things like LiDAR to overlay over satellite imagery, imagery that we kind of color code by elevation of the terrain, and bring a lot of these to the surface. So you can sometimes see, even when there was a really obvious feature to the right, there's actually a whole load more going on in this floodplain. But of course, where the real river is today is this blue line here. And since that river was transformed to this blue line, someone's built a farm and a sewage treatment works in the middle of what would have been the floodplain. In fact, the sewage treatment works is right in the middle of where one of the channels would have been flowing. So we live in a drainage-based landscape. So complete is the draining of the UK landscape that we think it's normal. People think it's natural. They don't realise that the great British countryside is so hydrologically artificial as to be utterly unrecognisable from what it naturally would have been. So how did we get here? What's going on? Well, actually, the history of it goes back quite a long way, all the way back from, we started messing about with rivers pretty much as soon as we could. Bronze Age fording, just to be able to get around the landscapes. When the Romans arrived, they really went at it. They were very good at this sort of thing. They started channelizing a lot of river, trying to send water where they wanted it. Then we had the system of medieval mills, and particularly in the south of the country, water meadows, and still being dug by hand, but huge land armies of people altering our rivers. And then, of course, the Industrial Revolution comes along. We start seeing steam engines out on the land. A lot of rivers were made navigable, and an awful lot more mills were built. So it really ramped up then. But the biggest step change in the change of our river landscape came after the Second World War. So during the Second World War, the country obviously took a bit of a shock in terms of its dependency for food from abroad. There was rationing in place, and once the war was over, all of huge areas of Europe needed to be rebuilt. There were millions of people that needed to be fed, and so the landscape was changed on a really industrial scale. Some of it actually started as tank defenses to begin with. A lot of rivers, certainly around where I am, you still find rivers that were dredged out and have kind of concrete pillars and things put along the side, all part of the kind of Fortress Britain mentality to create those kind of barriers. But mostly it was about increased agricultural production. It was about getting the water off the land and out to sea as quickly as possible. And the result is this canalization of our rivers, turning them from those kind of braided floodplain features into boxed in, heavily controlled, heavily constrained channels. And this actually happened all over Europe. There's the Danube is a example that's often cited. It's a great example here of what the Danube near Vienna looked like in 1849. And this is what it looked like in 1912. So that's even before the world wars. This was already happening. This is something that we, as a species, already had a pretty good handle on. We knew how to do this and how to do it well. And so complete is the channelization of our floodplains that even our concept of what a river channel should look like is a bit skewed. What many people would see as a normal river is just a land drain. It's a giant ditch with the sole engineered purpose of getting water off the land and out to sea as efficiently as possible. Now, on top of the historic abuse of our rivers, we now have a plethora of new issues affecting river habitat. So in many cases, we see channel widening, and there's a few things that can cause this. There's sometimes quite specific things like signal crayfish. You can see how long ago this photograph is because I've still got hair. But widening can also be caused by poaching by livestock, or sometimes you don't need to have big heavy cows trampling down the bank. All you need is to have animals grazing so heavily that you lose your rootstock, and very quickly you can have block failure and your river's starting to widen out and change shape, erode, and turn into something they shouldn't be at a rate that it shouldn't happen. Good example here, you can actually see all the gravel in that bank, suggesting that this river's also at some point been dredged, because that's essentially the riverbed there and the river's below it. We also have invasive species like the classic examples, Japanese knotweed and Himalayan balsam, very, very widespread, especially on riverbanks. Now, these are obviously a problem in terms of biodiversity because they outcompete all other species and you end up with a bit of a monoculture, but they're doubly impacting because they die back to pretty much nothing during the winter, and what we're left with is these sort of bare exposed banks that rapidly erode. We see a lot of overshading of our rivers. A lot of rivers were at some point heavily managed, overmanaged in terms of tree cover, and at some point that just stopped. And so we quite often see a lot of rivers where trees were coppiced down at some point in the past, uniformly all the way along, and then no one came back. And so they've all regrown to a uniform height, and we have a uniform density of canopy. And so you get these really dark tunnels, which interferes with primary production. We can also see the direct opposite of that. We can see rivers where there's not enough tree cover. It's a bit of a crazy chalk stream example here, where there is actually supposed to be a river under there somewhere. And although that's a relatively diverse kind of community of plants growing there, it's effectively all one habitat. And it's essentially the margins of the river all the way across the river. Now, perhaps my biggest pet hate of things you'll come across on the river are artificial impoundments. Lots of different examples, particularly with more urban rivers. You'll find an awful lot of concrete poured, but you'll also find structures in more rural settings that were previously connected to mills or something like that. And obviously they're a huge problem for fish passage. We always think about fish passage in terms of what we call migratory fish, so salmon and sea trout, eels maybe, but actually all fish are migratory. There's probably 2 species of freshwater fish that you could say aren't migratory. All the rest of them need to move sometimes hundreds of kilometers to get to different types of habitat for different parts of their life cycles. And you'll find these kind of structures, like I said, mills is an obvious one, but of course, reservoirs. You often find that they were installed for some sort of fisheries management, for heavily stocked fisheries, often for landscaping. I always say capability Brown's got an awful lot to answer for. Increasingly nowadays for hydroelectric power, and the Environment Agency has its own ones out there for flow gauging. So what do these do? Well, the impact of a weir on the river upstream, it slows the river down. It pushes the water level up, takes the gradient out of the riverbed, and that slows everything down. And when you slow it down, you get uniform deposition of fine sediment. You get accumulation of excess pollutants and nutrients. You often then get a loss of spawning and juvenile habitat for gravel spawning fish. Obviously, they are a barrier to fish passage themselves as well. And the impact can actually be it can actually spread a lot further than just the immediate impounded reach, because of the way that weirs impact natural geomorphology. If you want to understand how rivers work, you need to think of them not necessarily as bodies of water, but conveyor belts of sediment where the water is just the lubricant. And when you interrupt that movement of sediment down the system, the morphology of the river starts to change. So it can be suppressed, and upstream, especially where that gravel's no longer moving, you get kind of the problems discussed on the last slide. And then downstream, you can end up with a deficit of sediment, and that can result in deepening of the channel. It can reduce bank stability, can increase bank erosion. And then, of course, where we've got the deposition of fine sediment upstream, you can the habitat there significantly changes as well. In a natural river channel, you've got a range of different depths. You've got something which is normally quite diverse in its physical shape. Once that's impounded and starts to fill up with silt, it's becoming much more uniform. It's becoming one type of habitat, and so supports a much narrower range of species. And the great thing about weirs is it works both ways. It's something that there's a very, very not easy, but very simple remedy for. And taking those structures out is one of the most significant things we can do to improve the health of our rivers. Now, of course, there are actually more barriers than just weirs and dams. There's lots of other things that fish find it very difficult to get past. And it's quite difficult to know even how many there are. We have tried mapping them. There are maps that try to show what we've got. I would say that these maps probably capture 30%, if that, I think, of the barriers out there. We are always finding barriers that aren't on the maps, but just looking at the ones that we know about, and that are mapped, thousands, absolutely thousands. Our rivers have been just chopped up into disconnected, sort of isolated, vulnerable sections of river. And you'll see a lot of fish passes and fish passage easements attached to some of these structures to try and help fish get upstream. And they do work. They can help a lot of fish get upstream. But they have a cumulative impact. And there's some research that was done by the University of Sheffield that shows that, even if barriers are 90% passable, even if 9 out of 10 fish that try to get past them, once you've got 30 of those barriers on a system, it cumulatively, it's as good as one totally impassable barrier. So what can we do? How do we go about fixing this? Well, if we want to improve habitat, first of all, we need to understand the habitat we've got. We need to know what's good, what's bad, what's abundant, what's missing, and perhaps most importantly, what's happened. So first step is to get out and have a look. We do a lot of work now using GIS, so you can go out and map things in real time. We can use that data to actually build up a picture of what parts of our river catchments have good habitat, which parts have bad habitat, what sort of barriers we've got between those types of habitat. And we can, there's some really great resources nowadays to you can go online and look at maps, look at old maps and superimpose those over aerial photography, and you can see things like where the river used to be, and when it was straightened, when it was diverted, and that helps you build up a picture of what you need to do next. The next thing is to identify opportunities on the ground. So for a certain section of river, what sort of materials have you got nearby? Do you have trees on the riverbank? Do you have some gravel nearby you can do something with? What sort of vegetation have you got growing in and around the river? And mapping out and figuring out these opportunities is a really important step in planning and designing river restoration projects. And the great thing is nowadays is that we do have the tools that we can essentially walk along the riverbank and scribble this stuff down as we see it, and then later on kind of use that as a base to start forming a design around. Having made a plan, we can then start on trying to actually remedy some of the woes of our rivers. The point I'm trying to make with this slide is that it's not linear. We don't start from a bad place and get to a good place in one go. Almost never happens. It's nearly always a kind of reiterative process. So something's done, makes an improvement. Okay, that went well. What was missing? What's still not working well? And you start the process again. One of the first places to start in river restoration is normally trees. Fish really do live in trees. Submerged woody debris, it's an ideal habitat for fish. It provides cover from predators, refuge from strong flows. It interacts with flows and river morphology to carve out this kind of ever-changing habitat with habitat niches of all different shapes and sizes kind of popping up and disappearing again, depending on flows and the time of year. It's also really important, submerged woody debris is both refuge and restaurant to freshwater invertebrates. There was a great study published in 2017 that looked at the impacts of woody material used in river restoration. And that study determined both the abundance of freshwater invertebrates increased where woody debris was used in a river restoration, but also that the species richness increased, that actually populations of rarer species increased and appeared where they weren't there before when woody material was reintroduced to rivers. There's lots of ways that this can be done. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the very, very sort of basic woody type of habitat enhancement, which is the humble flow deflector. It is essentially a log pinned to the riverbed. It's not particularly natural, but the way that it interacts with the flow is predictable. And it is at least a mild recreation of natural habitat. So the way these works is that the flow rolls over a log, and that deflects it across the channel. It causes scour on the riverbed. It causes an area of fast flow next to an area of slower flow. So you're just introducing that diversity. If you have a stream that is suitable for it, and this is where some of the sort of lowland rivers and the chalk streams that are quite benign in their flows, you can get away with this sort of thing, where actually you can stake in some very simple flow deflectors in a kind of alternating pattern down the river, and just wait for nature to take its course, really, and let the river kind of slowly creep its way into a new sort of plan form. Now, flow deflection is especially important for gravel spawning fish like salmon and trout. They need nice, clean gravel to lay their eggs on. When a tree limb or a tree or any other piece of sort of large woody debris falls into a river, what generally happens is that the river scours around it, and that lifts up the gravel off the riverbed. And in doing so, the gravel ends up being graded by size. The finer material will be carried the furthest because it's the lightest. The larger stuff is heavier, it will drop out of the flow soonest. So that scours away the fine sediment, and that means that the interstices between the gravel are opened up, and that's what the gravel spawning fish are doing. That's why they lay their eggs in the gravel, is that it's a medium that's going to hold those eggs in place. And whilst they're there, they're getting, in theory, hopefully, a good flow of water going through that gravel. And with that, it's bringing oxygen and keeping those eggs alive. Probably the next basic sort of woody river restoration structure is the brushwood berm. This is something we use quite a lot on the chalk streams, but I have actually used this on much spatier rivers, and it actually in some cases can be better on more energetic rivers. Very easy to make. It's essentially a load of branches pinned to the riverbed in a sort of dense matrix. It traps silt, and in that silt will be the seed bank, and then marginal plants start to grow in it, and eventually it sort of ends up being sort of a natural riverbank. Now, this example here, this is on a actually quite a spatey river, but the brushwood berm has been positioned on the inside of a bend where deposition's naturally occurring. So even in a really energetic stream, if you've got somewhere that's already depositional, then what you're doing is you're speeding up that deposition, and that can actually quite rapidly evolve into new marginal habitat. So to illustrate that, this is an example on a chalk stream, brushwood berm that's been in place for I think probably about 6 months at this stage, and you can see that the riverbed around the structure where that's been a bit more pinched up has scoured away and is cleaning up, and we're starting to see nice clean gravels, whereas the flow moving through the structure is slowed right down, sediment drops out of suspension, and then in that sediment things start to grow. Example here, this is downstream of an old mill in Dorset, and there's a restoration project here that was done, entirely using this sort of brushwood berm technique. And a year or two later, that completely changed into something where we had much greater depth of water, flowing water, fish and invertebrates and all the rest of it all moved back. Now, the problem with those two techniques is that although they are predictable and repeatable and relatively low risk, are they really providing the best habitat? Is it the best we can do? Are we approaching it from an all too tidy, all too human perspective? And increasingly nowadays, there's a question I ask myself and my colleagues, which is, what would a storm do? Nowadays, we tend to submit our designs for consent referring not to large woody debris or flow deflectors or brushwood berms, but to what we call fallen tree analogues. And this is all about, in some cases, making use of natural features. So, what happens when a tree falls in? How can we use that to our benefit? Or how can we replicate the kind of habitat and the kind of processes that occur when trees naturally fall into rivers? And as an example here, this is just a very, very basic, so it was a very small willow tree that was hinged over into the river, pinned down, and about 3 years later, went back and had a look at it, and there's an entire reed bed. In fact, it actually extends well below this, downstream of off the side of this picture, entirely developed just because of that one small tree. And that took about 5 minutes to put in. So increasingly nowadays, we try to focus on things like hinging, which is essentially hedge laying on a larger, wetter scale. It's a great way of mimicking fallen natural tree habitat. It's surprisingly secure, that actually even a relatively small bit of wood still attached to the roots, it's very unlikely to be torn out by the river. It's extremely time and cost efficient. And you'd be surprised the sort of scales you can do it at. You can do it with some very big, mature trees, providing you're going for the right species. And generally, it's the sort of thing that you would do with willow, because it's so flexible that it can take it. It can be laid over like hazel would be in a hedge. Now, there's lots of different ways you might want to approach this, depending on how energetic your river is. You might want to bolster that up with some additional stakes in the forks of the limb, just to hold that in place. But generally, it's a very, very effective technique. Very quick, very easy, and very natural. Another thing we tend to look at these days is to ask ourselves, are we working with natural processes? So we can actually get better results if we only build half a brushwood berm. If you only build the upstream half and let the river finish the job for you, it's not as predictable. It's certainly not as tidy, and it's not as quick, but you can't get it wrong, because the channel will adjust to the correct dimensions as dictated by its flow regime and its sediment load, rather than as dictated by the shape of the structure you've built. So as before, that the sediment drops out as it moves through that sort of coarse brushwood. It speeds up around the outside, and you can start to get really quite pronounced changes. Example here, it's I wish I had a bit more of a zoomed out example, to be honest, but this is, I think hopefully you can see that huge increase in ranunculus growth to the left of the picture compared to the right, and that is because the flow has sped up. It's a flow loving plant as it is. It likes to be sort of pulled on a bit by the water, but also there's just not the fine sediment, so it's not getting smothered in fine sediment, it's not getting smothered in algae, can have access to the sunlight, and it's growing really prolifically. And we can take that approach, going right the way back to that basic kind of flow deflector, by thinking, well, can we do the same thing but use less orderly shapes, less predictable? This example here is one that is actually from my local wild trout trust officer put this in the river for me, and that actually there was no chainsaws involved. That was a limb that had fallen off a tree nearby, and so the approach was to actually try and pin that into the riverbed as naturally as possible. And you can see there's a scour pool that's formed off the edge of that. That's there's going to be some fish sat in that, but also the gravel downstream is cleaning up, so potentially making some really nice spawning habitat. Now, some of those techniques are not going to be particularly viable in a really high energy stream, but trees are still probably your go-to technique, the first thing you might want to think about. You just need to think about doing it slightly differently. So something that's kind of useful, to perhaps it's perhaps a more kind of ephemeral technique, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And that's a cabled kicker. So this is actually felling a tree or a large limb and cabling it back to its root ball. Now this is great because in high flows, the river can river will kind of push it up against the bank and out of the flow, so it's less likely to get torn out. It's held on by what I like to use is stainless steel wire rope, because when you're done, you can go back and take it off and reuse it. And it provides really good refuge habitat for fish. And some of our rivers where they've been channelized, we don't have that refuge habitat. So really interesting technique, that one. Really, really quick and easy. You could get 5 to 10 of those put in a river in a day very easily with a couple of people. And you can combine those techniques. I think probably one of the higher energy rivers I've worked on is the River Otter in Devon. And this example here is a hinged willow, still attached to its roots, but also with a stainless steel wire rope, holding it on as a kind of redundancy, and with a couple of stakes down in the river. And the idea there is just to hold it in place until the willow puts down roots, and then it will look after itself. And again, you could come back, take that cable off, and use it somewhere else. Going back to logs, something you will probably see a lot of people when they talk about natural flood management or NFM. This is the first thing they think of. I would say that NFM is somewhere where we really need to be asking ourselves, what would a storm do? And I'll tell you what, it wouldn't be building a vertical pile of logs. This is something that just doesn't occur in nature. What's natural about that? Is we need to ask ourselves, what happens when that eventually fails? Where are those logs going to go? What sort of problems are they causing whilst they're there? Can we get better results by mimicking natural incidents? So this is a project we delivered down in the New Forest. The rule we had here was no chainsaws. So all of this work was done using a excavator and a forestry tractor with a really good winch on it. And the idea was that we were going to imagine a storm's blown through and it's knocked over a load of trees down into this ditch. And that was going to be our NFM project. So it was very, very quick and easy, very cheap actually, but surprisingly effective. What was really interesting was the impact on water quality. So these photographs are taken on the same day, walking downstream. So upstream, that's very sort of cloudy water. You see there's a lot of sediment coming in. And then as we start to work our way downstream, that water starts to clear. Still that kind of brown peat stain of the New Forest, but by the time we get towards the bottom, really clear. And that's because it's a coarse sort of structure. There's a lot of friction on it, so it's providing that natural flood management benefit, but it's doing something else as well. And it's also providing really good habitat. Moving on to the sort of slightly more technical techniques. re-meandering or unstraightened or re-wiggling, whatever you want to call it. This can be done in lots of different ways at lots of different scales. This is a project we delivered in the autumn. In this case, we had a 45-ton long reach excavator doing it for us. And you can do this at all kinds of scales. So this can actually be done at quite a big scale and quite big rivers, trying to return them back to a more natural state. And it's something we've been doing a lot of on the chalk streams, because when the chalk streams were straightened and dredged, because they are so benign and slow flowing, and they have such a low sediment load in them, they don't unstraighten themselves very readily. They, you know, once if you knacker up a chalk stream, it's going to stay knackered. But can be done at lots of different scales. It's a nice example here on one of our smaller streams, and another example here which is using those sort of brushwood berms. And this was a volunteer-led project on a middle of a triple SI grassland where we couldn't get any kind of heavy machinery near the river at all. Within that same sort of theme, we do a lot of work now looking to try and actually undredge the rivers to actually raise the bed back up. This year we put over 6,000 tons of gravel into the River Test and its tributaries. And there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can buy in quarried gravel. So two images at the top there, that would be gravel that's been brought in by a lorry from a quarry. The advantage of that is it's cleaner, comes washed, doesn't have all the sort of fine material in it. But the disadvantages of it are A, it's very expensive, and B, it's not quite as natural. It's not gonna work, and it's not going to behave quite the same way that the natural gravel in the riverbed would. But it can have a really stark difference. So here's a very quick before and after of a bed raising project. Another one also from last year. This was it in the summer, really heavily dredged, and then this is essentially that same river undredged, with the riverbed brought back up. And it's going to be really exciting to see what happens here. We're really interested to see what sort of plant communities come in first. You know, will we get kind of ranunculus returning to the riverbed here? What sort of how's the ecology going to change? You know, what's going to happen with the fish and invertebrates and all the rest of it. We do some projects where we are lowering riverbanks. You can't always undredge a dredged river, because post dredging sometimes we built houses and roads and railways in the floodplain. So, you know, what can we do to at least try and reconnect the riparian zone of the floodplain? So we've had some really big projects in the last year to try and address that problem, and to try and recreate that sort of low floodplain habitat around the river, where we can't just, you know, wholesale bed raise the entire river back up. And of course, most projects are actually it's a combination. You're mixing and matching. You're matching the right technique to the right problem. You know, the right medicine for the right illness. And you can do things like use woody material and then grade riverbanks down over it. So you've got both in the river. You can build a berm on one side and then grade the riverbank back on the other side, and kickstart the process of the river starting to re-meander and sort of forge a more natural path. We've had quite a few examples now, particularly on the River Test, where it's a very expensive, very lucrative trout fishery, where having lots of big scruffy things in the river is bad for business. So we're essentially sneaking the woody material in by stealth. So we build a bank toe with it, backfill with gravel and then soil, and then let that grow up, and you get a really nice kind of marginal fringe. You get kind of all of that biodiversity returning to the river, but people can still get to the riverbank relatively easily and still fish. Or in some cases, you know, we're mixing the techniques up. So we might have bank that people can access on one side and have more of a kind of woody habitat on the other. And yeah, having that real mix of results makes a really big difference. Going back to that sort of building half a burn technique, you can see what happens there, where actually you starting to see the gravel piling up to around the outside of this berm, and that's sort of the river kind of scouring clean and starting to drop the finer sediment in the lee of the structure. So we're getting the ranunculus coming back, but we're also getting some really nice sort of slack water habitat right next to some faster flowing habitat. So you're getting, you know, two habitats for the price of one, essentially. This is on the Hampshire Avon from a few years ago. Riverbed was an absolute desert. There was nothing growing. And on this example, we dropped in, that's actually a hinge. It's a pretty hefty tree, dropped it on one side, and some sort of something made in the shape of a tree, but not actually a tree on the other side, because there wasn't a tree there to use. And then just waiting a couple of years, and you can see from that drone shot there, again, the ranunculus comes back, the other river plants come back, and you know that's it's all about breathing that energy and that movement of sediment back into the river. Same with the sort of the riparian fringe of the river. Especially on the chalk streams, that's where a lot of the biodiversity is. You see a lot of this sort of thing, this kind of vertical revetment going on, that's been built for years and years and years on these chalk streams, and our approach is to smash that right down, get some woody material in there, get some soil and some gravel, get some plants in there, and then just you know, wait to see what happens, really. We had some really good results on that. Another example I like to show people, this is from quite a few years ago now. This is the on the River Loddon at Arborfield. This is actually a fish passage channel to bypass around a weir. It's a great example of how kind of thinking outside of the traditional kind of engineering box can get some really good results. So this is at the upstream end, actually quite a standard pool and traverse, hard engineered fish pass. You know, you can kind of see exactly what it's supposed to be doing, especially up at this top end where it's sort of poured concrete, lets a very fixed amount of water down this side channel. But you wouldn't necessarily recognize the lower part of this channel as being part of an engineered fish pass. This at the time this photograph was taken, that river is not even a year old. That's brand new excavated river. It's if you turn the camera around, you'll be pointing back up at that concrete. And the real kind of jewel in the crown of this project is something that happened entirely by accident. A really great bit of habitat, and this was a tree that came down during the very early stages of the project, and it just happened to fall over exactly where the new river was supposed to be. And you know, the chainsaws were pretty much ready to go, revved up to cut that thing out the way. And we stopped and had to think about it and thought, well, hang on a minute, what if we get in there with some spades instead and dig it out a little bit, not to the full size of the new channel, just a little bit. And then when we excavate the new channel, we'll let the river blast its way through. And that's what happened. And it's really great bit of habitat. And I think it actually makes a big difference to this project. Every time that we get to high flow, the river cuts underneath it, throws up new gravel, creates new spawning habitat. There's actually fish spawning in the bypass channel itself, rather than it just being a means to an end, a route to get somewhere else. And in that sort of in that vein of thought, you know, cutting around, sometimes you might as well start again. Sometimes the channel is too damaged to fix. Sometimes it's cheaper, easier, or just more effective to dig a new river. And this happens at all kinds of scales, big or small. big scale here. Example here, this is a small scale example from again was delivered just last autumn, and in this case we essentially cut a whole new river channel through there, and then that's started flowing again this spring, and we're really excited to see what starts what grows up here, what happens next. And we'll probably come back and do an extra layer of habitat on this. We'll probably let this develop for a year or two and then come back and start putting in some chunky woody stuff to kind of finish that off. And an example that is sort of 10 minutes walk down the road from where I'm sat, actually. This is on the River Wylye. This, believe it or not, is an Environment Agency project. Back when the Environment Agency used to deliver projects like this, and it's absolutely brilliant. There was an old mill leat that had breached. It was causing lots of problems, and rather than repair it, the owner actually came up with the idea and said, well, why don't we just go around instead? Which is actually what they did. They cut a new river channel. Lots of the techniques you've seen here. They brought some gravel in, found some gravel in the floodplain. They used some woody material, and that's then developed over time into one of the most interesting bits of the whole river now. It's an absolutely fantastic job. And that's all kind of diggers and dumpers and heavy machinery, but actually a lot of river restoration can be done at a community level. It's something that can be and is delivered by volunteers all over the country. We had loads of volunteers in the river this year, and it was really, really great. It's a great way for us to engage with people. We get our kind of education team out there, and they kind of they go around, I suppose, planting messages by stealth in the minds of the people that come along, which is fantastic. But it's actually a great thing to do. I think people really enjoy getting hands-on. It's a way of getting people invested in their rivers, and actually, people care about the health of the river because it's something that they've got up close and personal with. They've invested their own time in looking after it. So, where are we going? What's happening with river restoration? I said earlier that it's never end to end. It's you're kind of going round in a circle. You do some improvements, have another look, do some more, and a big part of that is winning over stakeholders. You can only deliver these projects by the consent of the people that own the land, using the constraints of whoever's giving you the money to do it. So winning over landowners, fisheries, local communities, regulators, sometimes that is an iterative approach. So sort of thing, we put something in, and you were okay with that bit of wood. How about something bigger? That limb produced some nice habitat, didn't impact your fishing. How about we go a little bit braver? This section of rivers looking great. What do we think about doing going forward? Let's be bigger, let's be braver, let's be bolder. And increasingly we're now starting to see river restoration projects, even on quite conservative, quite traditional parts of the chalk streams, especially where we don't use the word necessarily rewilding, because for some people it's a bit of a triggering word, but essentially what we're looking at doing, really scruffing up these rivers and letting nature take its course. So what does that sort of scruffy approach look like when it's all grown in? Well, this is a before, immediately after, 6 months later, and you can start to see really, really instant results, quite significant before, after, 6 months later. Same again here, before, after, 6 months later. So this is just the start of the process. With river restoration, generally I would tell people that it's it's at least a 5-year recovery from the initial intervention. So you're not going to see that an instant finished article, but you will start to see changes. Those changes will start happening pretty much straight away. So that same project those photos are from, this is what that river looks like 18 months later. So really starting to see an improvement now. I need to get out there and get back actually and see it again this year. But this was a project where the riverbed was completely smothered in fine silt. There was almost no weed growing, and it's looking really fantastic now. And on that kind of theme of rewilding, something we have to gaze into the crystal ball now and think about is that beavers are back, whether we like it or not, whether licensed or not, whether planned or not, they're back. This is a small beaver dam I went to go and see in 2018. It's about I'd say 1.5 meters high, 3 or 4 meters wide at that point. I went back to see that same one last year. That's what it looks like now. That short section in the previous slide is somewhere in that hedge. It's about that big. So these are big changes that we are going to see to our floodplains. There is going to be conflict. There's going to be some challenges, but there's also, I think, going to be some quite significant benefits. Really interesting to see what was happening to the floodplain, starting to see that braided, anastomosed wetland habitat coming back. And you can see in some of these photos, these clumps, these iris starting to work its way back up through. Previously this was a grazing field. This is actually going from I think a horse paddock or something back into a wetland habitat. So definitely we're going to start seeing some big changes, and I think probably the mindset will shift, and we will start thinking more and more about full floodplain restoration, not just in channel river restoration.